This lecture this week, we're talking about the new nation 1783 to 1791. Of course, we're dealing with the questions of what happens after the revolution, how the country is created, how the country is created politically. And I've put two images here, which I think are important to help us understand this period. Note that they are not images of the Constitution, but on the left is an image of the Articles of Confederation, right? Our Confederation and perpetual union between the states. And on the right is a drawing of something called the Federal Ship Hamilton. Now, this is an engraving depicting the centerpiece of the Grand Federal Procession in New York City in 1788 that celebrated the ratification of the Constitution. The ship had over 30 seamen and fired several 13-gun salutes during the parade, 13 obviously for the 13 states. And Alexander Hamilton was, of course, one of the key nationalists, and nationalist is a term I will use a lot in this lecture, and of course an author of The Federalist, which made the argument for ratification, especially for ratification in New York State, which was very, very important. So here's what I want to talk about today. America under the Confederation, a new constitution, the ratification debate, and the origins of the Bill of Rights, and what we might call we the people, which is an interesting phrase and an interesting concept for this whole period that we're talking about. The nation's first written constitution was the Articles of Confederation, drafted by Congress in 1777 and approved by the states in 1781. The Articles were an attempt to balance the national coordination needed to win the war against fears that centralized power threatened liberty. With the Articles, the 13 states retained their own sovereignty. The national government was a one-house Congress in which each state had only one vote. No president existed to enforce the laws. The executive was sort of contained within the Congress. And no judiciary existed to interpret laws. All the judiciary was handled at the state level. Major decisions required the approval of 9 states rather than a simple majority, so the sort of two-thirds majority idea. The national government only had the powers to regulate war, that is, to declare war and to conduct foreign relations. Congress could issue money, but not impose taxes or regulate commerce, and its revenue came from the voluntary contributions of state governments. Amendments to the Articles had to be unanimous, and they never received enough votes to pass. And although the Articles made a strong central government possible, they did enable the states to surrender their disputed claims to Western lands and give them to the federal government. That's perhaps the most important achievement of the Articles of Confederation, the idea to hand over Western territorial control to the federal government. Now here's a map of Western lands, 1782 to 1802. Again, in this course, you'll start to notice we talk about the West, the West, the West all the time, and that's because there's too much concentration, frankly, in most history courses on what's happening in the 13 original states. The creation of a nationally controlled public domain from Western lands ceded by the states is one of the major achievements of the federal government after the Articles of Confederation. Okay, and all those Western lands you see there leading up to the Mississippi and running up right against what would eventually become the Louisiana Purchase. The national government established rules for settling the enormous new national domain in the West. While Americans considered it empty, it was, of course, inhabited by over 100,000 Native Americans. When Congress declared independence from Britain, it argued that Native Americans had forfeited their rights to the land when they sided with the British, despite the fact that only certain tribes had done so. The government secured from the Indians much of the land north of the Ohio River, but left small parts of lands in the south to be held permanently by the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw tribes. Though many national leaders believed that the nation's prosperity depended on farmers gaining western lands, others saw government land sales as a source of revenue, and some worried that it would cause perennial conflict with Native Americans. Private land companies hoped to buy up the land and sell it to settlers at a huge profit. Now, the war's end caused a huge number of Americans to migrate west into upstate New York and into what became Kentucky and Tennessee. They believed their right to take Western lands was essential to American freedom. They ignored Native American land titles, demanded that the government sell or give away the land, and often settled land to which they had no legal title. They just settled it anyway. Many national leaders worried that these settlers were unruly and disorderly and would incite war with Native Americans, and they sought to regulate Western settlement. This is designed for the Great Seal of the United States, produced by a committee of Congress in 1782. It includes the symbols of liberty, war, and peace, a shield with 13 stars, and an eagle, all below a Latin phrase meaning in defense of liberty. On the reverse, which is in this case illustrated in the upper right, is an unfinished pyramid with 13 steps and the Eye of Providence. You often see that pyramid on our currency even today. In the 1780s, Congress regulated the way Western land was sold and settled. The Ordinance of 1794, written by our friend Thomas Jefferson, established the steps by which these areas would be governed. The measure divided the region into districts first governed by the Congress and eventually admitted to the Union as states. Congress rejected by a single vote a clause in the bill that would have prohibited slavery in the entire West, something that helps cause the Civil War later on. In 1785, an ordinance regulated land sales in the region north of the Ohio River, which became known as the Old Northwest. This land was to be surveyed by the government and was sold in sections for just $1 per acre. This system was meant to control and concentrate settlement and raise revenue for Congress, but the settlers violated the rules by moving into areas where surveys hadn't been done. Now, initially, the minimum purchase required by the government was too large for individual farmers to pay. Much of the land that was sold to large land companies and speculators who then divided it and sold it to settlers at a huge profit. This caused many Americans in the coming decades to demand that the government provide free or cheap land. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 called for the eventual establishment of 3 to 5 states north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. This ensured Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. The United States would not rule its territories as a colonial power, but would allow these lands to become equal parts of the political system as self-governing states. The idea was that territorial expansion and self-government would grow together. This ordinance also recognized that Native Americans had claims to lands in this area and promised not to take their land without consent. Yet, national land policy assumed that Native Americans would sort of disappear as a result of disappear as sort of groups, as self-identified groups, as a result of purchase, as a result of treaties, voluntary removal, or kind of an old 18th century version of assimilation. The ordinance also, by the way, prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest, which is one of the main reasons why it wasn't there. This is an engraving from the Farmers and Mechanics Almanac showing farm families moving west along a primitive road. And if you can look on in detail, it's very primitive, ruts in the road and things like that. It's sort of an idealized engraving. It probably shows that it was easier or less uncomfortable than it actually was, but it's important to see what people thought was happening as well as what was actually happening. And here is a map of a series of ordinances in the 1780s, of course, that provided for the surveying and sale of lands in the public domains north of the Ohio River. And, of course, the eventual admissions of states carved from areas as equal members of the Union. Now, there were, of course, many problems with the Articles of Confederation. Many prominent Americans believed that the Articles were irredeemably flawed. First in their minds was the nation's economic crisis in the 1780s. To finance the Revolutionary War, Congress had borrowed large sums of money by selling interest-bearing bonds and paying soldiers and suppliers in notes to be redeemed later, right, at a later date. But without revenue, Congress was unable to pay the interest and the debts themselves. The British had borrowed American ships from trading with the West Indies, and European goods flooded the market, ruining the businesses of many artisans, driving down wages, and removing money from the economy. So states adopted their own relief measures, printing more money and postponing debt collection. Creditors saw these laws as infringements on their property rights. Debts, after all, were property. In late 1786 and early 1787, debt-ridden farmers closed courts in western Massachusetts to prevent the seizure of their lands for failure to pay taxes. The revolt came to be known as Shays' Rebellion, after one of their leaders, Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. The rebels, in demanding relief and the printing of paper money, thought they were continuing the revolution's traditions. So an army organized by the Massachusetts government quelled the rebellion with relatively little violence. I think there were 1,000 people arrested. The revolt convinced some influential Americans that a stronger national government was needed to encourage economic growth, to protect property, and to secure law and order. This is an engraving of a bankruptcy scene. Creditors repossess the belongings of a family unable to pay their debts, while a woman weeps in the background. Popular fears of bankruptcy led several states during the 1780s to pass laws postponing the collection of debts. Okay, here's where it gets interesting and potentially confusing. So please pay attention to the names and the labels and the titles that I'm using, because they will kind of change and they kind of won't, but it's something that causes a lot of misunderstanding about American history up until this day. Let me start off talking about nationalism and nationalists of the 1780s. One man afraid of a democratic excess was James Madison, a Virginian and a disciple of Thomas Jefferson, who led the movement to strengthen national government. He was joined by Alexander Hamilton of New York, the most vocal advocate of robust national government, who wanted to make the nation into a world military and commercial power. These nationalists found allies among others to whom the revolution had given the consciousness of a nation, if you will, such as army officers who were sort of schooled in the idea of that the army is a national thing, members of Congress, and diplomats. Influential economic interests such as bondholders who wanted Congress to be able to generate revenue in order to pay them back, and urban artisans who wanted tariff protection, joined with those who were afraid that the states were violating property rights, and they wanted this new group wanted to also to demand a stronger national government. So, in 1786, delegates from 6 states met at Annapolis, Maryland, to explore new ways to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. They proposed another gathering in Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation, and the fact that Shays' Rebellion had just happened stimulated support for this plan. Now, here is an engraving of James Madison, the father of the Constitution. This is a miniature portrait. This is something that you could carry in your pocket, something especially that like his wife could carry in his pocket, which was very common. This was painted by Charles Willson Peale in 1787. Madison was only, by the way, 36 years old when the Constitutional Convention met, and he more or less planned and wrote the Constitution. Here is Alexander Hamilton, another youthful leader of the Nationalists in the 1780s. He was born in the West Indies in 1755. This life-size portrait was commissioned by 5 New York merchants and painted by John Trumbull in 1792 when Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. And I think it's more or less from this portrait where we get the engraving that appears on our $10 bills. All right. Now, what happens at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia? Many of the 55 men who met at the Constitutional Convention were very prominent individuals. George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin. Men of education and great wealth, they were in their social status highly unrepresentative of most Americans. They shared a commitment to a stronger national government and belief that democracy had gone too far, especially the disbursement of democracy. They deliberated in private to ensure free and honest debate, and records of the proceedings were not published until 1840, when all the delegates, after which all the delegates had actually died. All the delegates agreed that there must be a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary in the new national government. The new Constitution would allow Congress to raise money through direct taxes without relying on state governments for revenue. The federal government would represent the people too. Even delegates who thought democracy had gone too far, though, rejected Hamilton's proposal for a king and a House of Lords. Believe it or not, yes, a king and a House of Lords. Debate centered on how to balance the federal and state governments and the interests of small and large states. Madison's Virginia plan proposed the creation of a two-house legislature with a state's population determining its representation in each house. Now, smaller states feared domination by the more populous states, and they countered with something called the New Jersey Plan, calling for a single-house Congress in which each state cast one vote. So the compromise that was reached formed a two-house Congress with a Senate in which each state had 2 members, and a House of Representatives where the members were apportioned according to a state's population. Senators would be chosen by state legislatures every 6 years, insulating them from shifts in public opinion. Representatives were elected every 2 years directly by the people. This is an example of revolutionary currency, a $50 note, huge amount of money, issued by the Continental Congress during the War of Independence. Congress's inability to raise funds to repair such paper money in gold or silver was a major reason why nationalists desired a stronger federal government. Now, the direct election of members of the House of Representatives was an expansion of democracy, but the government structure created by the Constitution represented a limitation on democracy overall. Delegates hoped to isolate the nation's government from popular sentiments that alarmed elites in the 1780s. They wanted to ensure that the right kind of men were elected to office. While the people would remain sovereign, they would choose those who governed from a small elite. They assumed that the Senate would be composed of each state's most prominent citizens, and that the House of Representatives and they made the House of Representatives quite small, assuming that only very prominent men could win elections in large districts. Neither the president nor federal judges could be elected directly. The president was to be chosen by an electoral college or by the House if the electoral college tied, and electors were not voted upon directly either. The Electoral College was an indirect means to elect the president because the delegates did not trust ordinary voters to choose the president and the vice president directly. The Constitution is actually quite brief and barely outlines the structure of the federal government. It embodies 2 basic principles: federalism, sometimes called the division of powers between the national government and the states, and the system of checks and balances among the 3 branches of the national government, also called the separation of powers. Okay, so you have those 2 different types of sharing out, or if you will, watering down of powers so that they're not concentrated in any one place. Here is a portrait of George Washington painted in the early 1790s by Charles Peale Polk. It's based on one that was done earlier, but it depicts Washington as he looked when he presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Not only Washington's leading of the army was important in his eventual becoming president, but the fact that he presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia made him the obvious choice for the first president, but we'll get to that later. Now, I haven't mentioned slavery so far, but slavery sparked debate at the Constitutional Convention. Although the word slavery and slave did not appear in the Constitution, The Constitution affected slavery as an institution. It prohibited Congress from banning the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. It required states to return fugitive slaves to their owners and stipulated that 3/5 of the slave population would be counted in determining each state's representation in the House of Representatives, and therefore in the Electoral College too. Many of these measures were proposed by delegates from South Carolina who were very, very fiercely pro-slavery. In fact, threatened to walk out if concessions weren't made to them, and they were. These compromises about slavery made it more central to American politics and life than ever before. The Constitution allowed the importation of slaves to continue until 1808, when Congress prohibited it. But by then, 170,000 more slaves had been brought to the United States, more than 1/4 of all the slaves carried to the country since 1700. The Fugitive Slave Clause gave slavery extraterritoriality. Slavery was a legal condition. It remained the status of the individual slave, even if that individual entered a free state where slavery had been abolished. The Constitution did not give the national government any authority to interfere with slavery in the states, and the 3/5 Clause gave the white South far more power in national affairs than its free population warranted, allowing it to dominate the House of Representatives and ensure that every president but 4 elected between 1788 and 1848 was a Southern slaveholder. This is a slave advertisement from a slave trading company. It appeared in a Richmond, Virginia newspaper only a few months after signing the Constitution. The company seeks to buy 100 slaves to sell to purchasers in states further south. And slavery was a major subject, as we say. This shows how slavery had to be a major subject of debate in the Constitutional Convention. Okay, how was the Constitution finalized? Well, the delegates finally approve the Constitution, right? And as I've said before in class, it's the overwhelming sentiment among the delegates is that we have to have some sort of constitution that can be passed and ratified. Okay, that's why all sorts of compromises are made. That's why all sorts of deals are made and all sorts of balances of power are agreed to. But once they had approved it, it had to be sent to the states to be ratified. Okay, the Constitution established a new framework for American development. It allowed a national market to develop by giving Congress power over tariffs, power over interstate commerce, power over the coinage of money, patents, bankruptcy rules, and prohibiting interference with property rights. And here is a famous painting of the signing of the Constitution by mid-19th century artist Thomas Pritchard Rossiter. It depicts the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Among the founders depicted here are James Wilson signing the document at the table in the center, and George Washington presiding from the dais with an image of the sun behind him. Now, it's unlikely that this is exactly what it looked like. Okay, it probably wasn't this staged in real life, but of course this is a portrait. This is a painting painted over 50 years later. Okay, now the ratification debate and ratification literature is absolutely fascinating. Even though the Constitution provided that it would go into effect when 9 states approved it, not all 13 states, as the Articles of Confederation required. Ratification was not certain. Each state held an election for delegates to a special statewide ratifying convention, and these elections generated intense activity. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay authored a series of 85 essays that appeared as The Federalist in 1788. Largely written, by the way, to make sure that the Constitution was ratified by New York. The Federalist, and what became known as the Federalist Papers, largely written because they were worried about New York. Now, these 3 men argued that the Constitution did not endanger American liberties and that it, in fact, protected them. Madison especially in essays number 10 and 51, developed a new vision of the relationship between government and society in the United States. He identified the basic dilemma of the new republic. Government must be based on the will of the people, but the people were susceptible to dangerous opinions, especially those that might threaten property rights. He worried that a growing number of poor people in the future might use their political power through their numbers, right, to secure a more, quote, a more equal distribution of wealth, which he thought was a dangerous thing. The solution for Madison was to be found in the republic's size and diversity. Previous republics, going all the way back to the Roman Republic, had always been small in size, but the size of America, he argued, would stabilize, not weaken, its government. In a nation so large, so many distinct interests would develop that no single interest would ever be able to take over the government and dominate the others. Every majority would be a coalition of minorities, securing the rights of individuals. Madison reassured Americans that they only had to extend the sphere to ensure the republic's perpetuation under the Constitution. Madison thus strengthened the idea that westward expansion was essential to American freedom. It made the structure of the government and its size, not its virtue, government and its size, the basis of republicanism, and advanced the liberal notion that men are motivated by self-interest and that social good emerges from conflict between private interests. This is a satirical engraving by Amos Doolittle. By the way, he had an image about the Battle of Concord we saw a couple of weeks ago, and it depicts some of the issues in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution. The wagon in the center is carrying Connecticut and sinking into the mud under the weight of debts and paper money as Federals and Anti-Federalists try to pull it out. Federals call for the state to comply with the Congress, that is, to pay money requisitioned by the national government, and the Anti-Federals, I should say, in this cartoon, reply, tax luxury and success to Shays, reference to Shays' Rebellion. Underneath the three merchant ships is a phrase criticizing the tariffs that the states imposed, the states were imposing on imports from one another. The Constitution prohibited this, by the way. And here is a late 18th century engraving of Americans celebrating the Constitution beneath the Temple of Liberty, a depiction of the Temple of Liberty. And here is an order of the Grand Federal Procession. In New York City, there was a Grand Federal Procession in 1788 celebrating the ratification of the Constitution. Members of each trade and occupation marched together. This document illustrates the variety of crafts in the pre-industrial New York City. Now, of course, there were those who opposed ratification, called the Anti-Federalists. They believed that the Constitution favored power more than liberty. They weren't as well organized as the Federalists, and they included many of the farmers who had sought economic relief in the 1780s. The Anti-Federalists predicted that the new government would be controlled by merchants, by creditors, and by others hostile to the interests of ordinary Americans. They believed that only a small republic could succeed, not an expansive republic, as Madison argued. Liberty was the watchword of the Anti-Federalists, and they charged that the Constitution did not protect individual rights such as trial by jury or freedom of speech and of the press, and that as the state constitutions had. Remember, this is the point at which the Constitution does not have any amendments yet. And by the way, you may wonder who an Anti-Federalist in this period would have been Thomas Jefferson. What was he doing? Well, he was actually in France as the ambassador to France. So he would have helped, he might very well have helped the Anti-Federalist cause during this period had he been in Philadelphia, but he wasn't. Now, pro-Constitution politics prevailed in cities and in rural areas that were integrated into the commercial marketplace. Its strongest supporters were men of great wealth, but the promise of prosperity also appealed to urban artisans, to laborers, and to sailors who thought a stronger central government would revive a lagging economy. Anti-federalism found most of its support in rural and frontier areas populated by struggling farmers. Ultimately, the pro-constitutionalist energy, their organization, and command of the press prevailed. Madison won support for the Constitution by promising that the first Congress would enact a Bill of Rights. And Madison was so well thought of, unlike, say, Alexander Hamilton, over whom there were conflicting opinions, that people believed him, right? And although many people in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia opposed the document, only Rhode Island and North Carolina voted against ratification. Of course, they eventually had to join eventually. Now, here is a banner carried by one of the many artisans that took part in New York City's Grand Federal Procession of 1788, celebrating the ratification of the Constitution, which I showed you the list of before. The banner depicts artisans at work in their shop and some of their products. The words "solid" and "pure" and the inscription at the upper right link the quality of their pewter to their opinion of the frame of the new government and the hopes of their future. The inscription reads, "The federal plan most solid and secure, Americans their freedom will endure, all arts shall flourish in Columbia's land, and all her sons join as one social band." Now, the compromise for ratification. The individual rights that are today protected by the Constitution and celebrated by Americans were not actually in the original document drafted in 1788. Remember, I just said Madison promised that Congress would pass a Bill of Rights in order to gain support for ratification, but he believed that such a bill was redundant and that it would not prevent majorities from violating constitutional rights in the future. But each new state constitution had a Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights was very much a sort of agreed upon addendum for ratification. So Madison presented a series of amendments that became the basis of the Bill of Rights ratified by the states in 1791. They included the First Amendment, which prohibited Congress from legislating about religion and protected the freedom of the press and assembly. The second, to upholding the right to bear arms and organizing militias. And other amendments affirming the right to trial by jury, prohibiting abuses such as arrest without warrants and forcing a person accused of a crime to testify against himself. The Ninth Amendment declared that rights not specifically mentioned in the Constitution were, quote, retained by the people, end quote, opening the door to establish new rights not articulated in the text. The 10th Amendment affirmed that powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states were reserved to the states. In other words, protecting the states against encroaching federal power. The Bill of Rights showed how the Revolution had changed America. Most remarkably, the Constitution had recognized religious freedom. The Constitution, unlike the Declaration of Independence, is entirely secular. It does not refer to God, and it bars religious tests for federal office holders. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from legislating on religious matters, which was a departure from colonial and British precedent. Now, here is a picture of called the Grand Federal Procession Banquet. This is after the Grand Federal Procession, which we saw in New York. Hundreds of marchers enjoyed a celebratory banquet. The 10 tables represented the states that had ratified by July 1788 when the procession took place. And this is a map of the ratification of the Constitution. Federalists who supported the Constitution obviously tended to be concentrated in the cities and nearby rural areas, while backcountry farmers were more likely to oppose the new frame of government. Now, this is an engraving and a poem published in 1788 in an American newspaper after New York became the 11th state to ratify the new Constitution. North Carolina would ratify eventually in 1789 and Rhode Island in 1790, but 1788 was the key date. Now, the creation of the United States required creating Americans. That is, people who considered themselves members of the new nation, not simply of individual states, but who qualified as an American citizen. The word citizen appears several times in the Constitution, but no definition is given. Despite the enormous prestige that the idea of citizenry acquired in the first half of the 19th century, there was no commonly agreed upon understanding of the rights that went with it or the role of the federal government in defining and guaranteeing those rights. Whites, male and female, born in the United States were commonly assumed to be citizens, but white women lacked basic rights enjoyed by men. Slaves were not American citizens, nor were Native Americans, but the status of free black Americans born in the United States remained highly controversial. Nowhere did they enjoy full equality before the law. Not until the Reconstruction era, following the Civil War, was a clear statement added to the Constitution that affirmed the principle of birthright citizenship, that anyone born in the United States, no matter his or her race, language, religion, national origin, or legal status of their parents, is an American citizen and entitled to the equal protection of the laws. Colonial Americans had been divided by ethnicity, by religion, by class, and by status, and united only by their allegiance to Great Britain. The Revolution created a new collective body, the American people, whose members were to enjoy freedom as members of a new political community. Since the government in the United States rested on the will of the people, establishing the identity of those people was important. The Constitution, after all, began with "we the people," but people did not include all those living within the United States. The Constitution identified three groups in the United States: Indians, who were to be treated as members of independent tribes and not part of the American nation; other persons, or slaves, that was the phrase used for slaves; and, quote, the people, the only group entitled to freedom in America. America at first seemed to offer a civic identity to all those who dedicated themselves to American political principles. However, only certain groups of people were deemed to be citizens in the new nation. This is a medal issued to Red Jacket, a Seneca chief, during his visit to Philadelphia, which was then the national capital in 1792. Remember, the national capital starts in New York, moves to Philadelphia, then moves to Washington, D.C. And it depicts George Washington offering an Indian a peace pipe. The agricultural scene in the background was intended to suggest that Indians should take up farming. So it's important for us to talk about and think about defining "we the people." The way that the early republic related to Indians and African Americans shows the contradictory principles shaping American national identity. American leaders agreed that Western Indian land should go to white Americans, but disagreed about which option was best for dealing with the Indian population: removal, disappearance, or assimilation into white civilization. Many Americans thought Indians were unfit for citizenship. Native American tribes were not represented in the new government. The treaty system gave them the unique status of independent sovereign nations, but treaties, often signed only by a few unrepresentative members of a tribe, were essentially a means of transferring Indian land to the state or federal governments. Military conflict in the Old Northwest continued until 1794, when a U.S. victory led to the Treaty of Greenville the next year, which gave most of Ohio and Indiana to the U.S. government and established an annuity system whereby tribes received annual grants of money at the cost of government interference in tribal affairs. Not all Americans believed that Indians were innately inferior to white Americans. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, believed they lived at a less advanced stage of civilization. In the 1790s, the federal government distributed agricultural tools and livestock to Indians to encourage them to adopt American ways of life. This is the signing of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, painted by an unknown member of General Anthony Wayne's staff. In the treaty, a group of tribes ceded most of their areas of the current states of Ohio and Indiana, along with the site that became the city of Chicago. They ceded that to the United States. And here is Indian tribes in 1795. By 1795, the Indian population had declined significantly from the colonial era, but the area west of the Appalachian Mountains was still known as Indian country. And here is a painting called The Plan of Civilization, circa 1800, by an unidentified artist. It depicts Benjamin Hawkins explaining the advantages of settled agriculture as part of a plan to promote, quote, civilization among Native Americans. Having served in the Continental Army during the War of Independence and as a senator from North Carolina, Hawkins was appointed in 1795 as superintendent of Indian affairs for the southeastern states. He supplied the Creeks, Cherokees, and Choctaws with agricultural training and farm implements, and he ultimately married a Creek woman. The status of free blacks in the early republic was ambiguous. The Constitution did not initially define who were citizens of the United States, so individual states defined the boundaries of freedom. In some states, North and South, free blacks had some rights, including the right to vote. But the vast majority of blacks were enslaved, and slaves were not considered members of the nation or fully eligible for citizenship, even if they were free. Early immigration policy shows that Americans excluded blacks from their conception of who was an American. The Naturalization Act, passed by Congress in 1790, first defined American nationality by allowing only free white persons to emigrate and become citizens. Although some believe that this law initiated a, quote, open immigration policy, the word white in the law excluded the majority of humankind from coming to America and becoming citizens. This is a graph showing the total population and the black population of the United States in 1790. Okay, and it's broken down by states, and you can, of course, see that the South, the enormous difference between New England, middle states, and the South in the number of African Americans, both slave and free. You may want to pause the lecture here and linger on those stats for some time. It's an amazing number. For instance, look at Maryland. 319,728 people total, of which 103,000-ish were slaves and 8,000-ish were free blacks. Okay. This is a portrait from around 1825. It depicts Euphemia Toussaint, a New York-born niece of Pierre Toussaint, who was a slave who had been brought to the city by his owner from the French colony of Saint-Dominique, which is modern-day Haiti, around 1787. Toussaint gained his freedom in 1807 and renamed himself in honor of the leader of the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s. He became a successful hairdresser and contributor to modern-day charities in the city. Born in 1815, however, his niece died at the age of 14. Right. And this is an advertisement for a runaway slave. The advertisement seeks the return of Ona Judge, a domestic slave of Martha Washington, who escaped in 1796 while the family was in Philadelphia, where George Washington served as president. She made her way to New Hampshire, where she spent the rest of her life evading efforts to recapture her. And finally, I want to talk about Jefferson's outlook on race and slavery, because it's a very important thing. John Locke, you see, had argued that liberty flowed from a man having the power of reason, and it did not seem a contradiction at this time, that is the 18th century, to deny liberty to irrational beings. Increasingly, white Americans saw blacks as lacking the qualities that enabled freedom Those qualities were self-control, reason, and allegiance to the larger community. Thomas Jefferson, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1787, claimed that African Americans, because of their nature and their experience in slavery, were disloyal to America. And he speculated that blacks were inherently inferior to whites. Now, while he maintained while he believed that Native Americans might have the capacity to become civilized as whites, he did not believe blacks naturally had this capacity. While hoping for the end of slavery and opposing the slave trade, he also supported colonization. That is, the idea that blacks, once freed from slavery, could never really be fully part of America and should be colonized in Africa or other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in his ambivalent approach to race and slavery, I think that Jefferson really reflected the thinking of his generation. That's why I kind of wanted to end the lecture on this, because this is sort of like the open-ended nature of what was going on in terms of attitudes towards race. While the decline of apprenticeship and indentured servitude expanded freedom for whites, the Revolution widened the divide between free Americans and enslaved Americans. Race now became a convenient justification for slavery in a nation dedicated to liberty. We, the people, increasingly meant only white Americans.